Have you ever felt like your head was about to split in two? Like the lights were too bright, the noise too loud, and all you can do is pray it stops? For so many women, migraines are more than just headaches. They're debilitating, they're exhausting, and during menopause, they seem to hit even harder. But here's the good news. You don't have to suffer in silence. Today, we're unpacking why migraines can feel so much worse during menopause and what you can do to fight back. Stick with us. Before the end of our episode, you'll get real advice on how to find the relief you need. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more real insights. Today's guest is Dr. Susan Hutchinson, a leading expert in the world of migraine care. She's a board-certified family physician and headache specialist, and she spent decades helping patients navigate the challenges of chronic migraines. Now she's dedicated to educating others, whether it's healthcare providers, medical students, or the public, on the science and the impact of migraines. She's also the author of The Woman's Guide to Managing Migraine, a great resource for understanding the powerful connection between hormones and headaches. We're excited to have her here today to share her insights and help you better understand and manage the migraines that can hit during menopause. Good morning, Dr. Hutchinson. I am so happy to have you on the podcast today.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
I know that you've dedicated so much of your career to migraine treatment and learning more about how migraines affect us all. But you've also experienced them, so that has to give you a very interesting perspective. How has that shaped your work and the way you connect with your patients?
Yeah, that's a great way to start. In my 30s, I had my own family medicine practice. So I did a little bit of everything, always a lot of women's health. And I began getting these disabling headaches in the middle of a busy workday. And I often had to lay down during my lunch break, turn off the lights in my office, put an ice pack on, and I thought they were just tension or stress headaches from owning my own medical practice. But around then, we had a category of medication come out called the triptans. And so I'm sure many of your listeners have maybe heard things like sumatriptan, rizatriptan. So out of desperation one day, I took what is normally considered a migraine-specific medication, and it helped. And that really began my journey seeing that even in my own practice as a physician, many of what I or my patients were calling sinus, tension headaches, stress headaches were really migraine. And I would say that's probably what started my passion was from my own personal experience.
If you've never had a migraine yourself, a lot of people think that it's just a bad headache, but there's so much more than that. Can you maybe describe what actually a migraine is and why it's different?
Yes, migraine is so much more than a headache, and that is often those that have never had a migraine, maybe no one in their family has, and they think it's just a bad headache, get over it. No, migraine is a whole disruption of what we call our nervous system. So in addition to the headache, you often get things like sensitivity to light and noise and smells. And what's really being appreciated in recent years with research is cognitive slowing, not feeling as sharp mentally. One of my patients calls it scrambled eggs. So you can imagine how disruptive that is if you've got children you're taking care of, if you have, work tasks to do. So think about, this incredible sensitivity to your environment. And often, but not always, there could be nausea and vomiting, which can be incredibly disruptive as well. In fact, sometimes in my busy practice, I would have to excuse myself from a patient, go into the next room, vomit, and, come back because I was in my own practice. I couldn't just go home sick. So again, it's a whole set of symptoms that goes along with the headache.
Oh, well, I've experienced migraines myself, and I think the first time I had one, I actually thought I was going to die. I had never experienced such intense pain. And yeah, talk about disruptive. I couldn't even get out of bed. And it kind of happened around the time I was starting to go through perimenopause. So how do hormones affect the way women experience a migraine, and what is that connection there?
Yeah, that's a great point to discuss because we know in at least 60% of women with migraine, there is a hormonal association. What do I mean by that? As you know, in women, our hormones go up and down depending on where we are in our menstrual cycle. And we think the biggest trigger is the drop in estrogen just before menses. And that's why for many women, their first migraine may start when they first start having their periods. Now, it's not that there aren't other hormonal changes, but the biggest seems to be that drop in estrogen. Now, you mentioned perimenopause. We often call that the change before the change. In perimenopause, which typically lasts for about 4 years before complete menopause, the hormones are all over the place, including the estrogen and progesterone. So it's very common that a woman could have migraines under fairly good control, but she hits perimenopause and they get really out of control. They get frequent, they're more disabling. And so there is a huge connection between what's going on hormonally for a woman and looking at the severity and frequency of her migraine attacks.
How should a woman who is experiencing migraines, how do you approach your doctor? Because typically you might be going to a gynecologist, right? If you're a woman who is, in that age group, is your gynecologist going to recognize the fact that the migraine is part of this hormonal change?
That's a good question, Holly. I think it depends on the gynecologist. Some gynecologists are comfortable diagnosing migraine, particularly because they're looking at the hormonal changes. Others may simply refer out to either the primary care provider or to a neurologist. But what I think a woman should do if she's noticing this association of migraine with whether it be the drop in estrogen before menses or with perimenopause is start keeping a calendar or diary. It can be electronic, it can be paper. They're free. And you can go to a website like headaches.org, which is through National Headache Foundation, and you can print out a paper diary. But there's so many, I think there's iHeadache, there's, just a number of free downloads and apps. So I think if you start keeping a diary or calendar, that can be very useful for the gynecologist to look at. Now, if it becomes clear that your gynecologist is not interested and maybe makes a comment like, well, it sounds like it could be migraine, but, I don't treat migraine, then you could find out, well, who do you think I should see? For some women, their gynecologist is their only provider. And I really encourage women as you become perimenopausal, if your gynecologist office doesn't look at the whole person and doesn't do also primary care, then really seek out finding ideally a female internal medicine doctor, possibly family medicine, but look for a provider that is going to look at all of you and look at those issues that are not just gynecology.
You mentioned some of the symptoms, I guess, or the side effects from migraines. Those are very debilitating. The nausea and the sensitivity to light. And how do we deal with those types of things and still live a day-to-day life, like you said, taking care of children or going to work?
I think it's so important to get appropriate care. And I think all patients with migraine deserve a migraine specific, what we call an acute medication, meaning you deserve to have something you take at the very beginning of an attack. And here's what's really good is now research is showing that you could take a migraine specific medication even before the headache starts. Some women have what's called a prodrome. It could be non-specific. It could be things like the light sensitivity. It could be maybe nausea. It could be craving chocolate. It could be irritability. It could be neck pain. But if a woman has identified there are certain symptoms that occur even before the headache phase of a migraine, how wonderful to take a migraine specific medication. And the category that's used a lot are called the triptans. They've been around since about, 1992, so a long time. Things like sumatriptan, rizatriptan. There's also a newer category, Holly, called the GPANs. And some names that might be familiar to your listeners would be Ubrelvy and Nortec. Those tend to be better tolerated, but the point is the goal is to have a treatment, a medication that you can take, and the goal is within 2 hours, you are free of not just the headache, but the nausea, the sensitivity to light. You have your life back.
That's a very good example of a time frame, because I think a lot of the time, myself included, you tend to suffer a little bit and you're thinking, I can wait it out. But how long is waiting it out?
Oh, I don't encourage anyone to wait it out because if unsuccessfully treated, typically a migraine attack can last 72 hours. That's 3 days. Now, there are some women that maybe they can just take something over the counter like ibuprofen, naproxen, Aleve, maybe lie down with an ice pack. Because another thing to emphasize here is not just taking a medication, thinking about your environment. For example, a lot of us spend a lot of time in front of the screen these days, and we know that the blue light coming from the screen can be aggravating. So, one treatment I often recommend to my patients is when they start getting a mild headache, step away from the screen. Lie down in a dark room with an ice pack for maybe 10, 20, 30 minutes, and perhaps taking an over the counter treatment like ibuprofen. Sometimes sipping a little caffeine can help. So, for some, that may be enough, but for others, again, they may need a specific acute medication like a triptan or a GPAN. And those are categories that any primary care provider should be quite comfortable prescribing.
I have a very good friend who, her method of treatment, and I bet you've probably heard this from other women before. It was Excedrin migraine, a large Diet Coke from McDonald's, and there was, oh, I think it was a chocolate. And that was the way she treated her migraines. Have you ever had women come up to you and or treated women who had these crazy ways of finding relief?
Oh, absolutely. Now, that sounds like a lot of caffeine, but one of the reasons why Excedrin is so popular is because it has three ingredients in it. It has aspirin, acetaminophen, which is Tylenol, and caffeine. And even though we get concerned, that some of us may drink too much caffeine, when you have a migraine, that caffeine can actually help. It can help with the throbbing. And I'll give you a quick example where it really helped me. Years ago, I went home to visit my mother. I think I was in medical school at the time. And I got up that morning and, she had the usual pot of coffee on. And later, I had this throbbing headache. My sister turned to me and said, "Oh, Susan, didn't mother tell you that she switched to decaf coffee?" Well, I was having a caffeine withdrawal headache, so I immediately went and got a big, large iced tea with caffeine, and that helped. So I think the role of caffeine, too much is not good, but when you have a headache, don't be afraid of caffeine.
Sometimes you're so desperate for relief that you will just about try anything.
I agree. And the other thing to emphasize is sometimes it is a cocktail. You can have things work together. So I'll give you an example. Maybe a patient might take a triptan or a GPAN, as I mentioned, one of the migraine specific medications, typically a tablet, but maybe they sip a little caffeine. Maybe they also take over the counter ibuprofen and sometimes an anti nausea medication. Because going back to your comment about the nausea for some patients, including myself, can actually be more disabling than the headache itself. And so there are a number of generic anti-nausea medication. One of my favorite to prescribe is 8 milligram orally dissolving Zofran, and that's spelled Zofran. There's a longer generic name called ondansetron, but it's every 8 hours for nausea, and that can also be really, really helpful for those that have nausea. But for those of you listening, if you're in a work environment, depending on the company, it's reasonable to consider, is your employer offering certain recommendations or what we call accommodations? Because migraine is considered a disability. It's recognized by the American Disability Act. So the larger the company, hopefully you have a dark, quiet place you can go. If you have your own personal office space, maybe, lie down in your room, in the dark with an ice pack. Sometimes doing things like not having fluorescent lighting can help. So there are some accommodations, and you can learn more about that too. There's a lot of good information again on the headaches.org, which is the official website of the National Headache Foundation.
That's good to know. We tend not to speak up for ourselves at work, but in terms of a migraine, that's a reasonable expectation that you might need on those days a little bit of a workaround.
Yeah, and the other thing to point out too is depending on what state you're in, but I think this is nationwide, Because migraine is considered, it's a legitimate, serious, chronic medical condition that may require intermittent times that it gets worse and you might have to not go to work. It's one thing to be at work and try to get into a dark, quiet room, but let's say you're missing 1 or 2 days a month of work because of a bad migraine. And, ideally with appropriate treatment, we can help prevent that. But if you are afraid that you're going to get into trouble and maybe get fired, you can ask your provider to fill out a Family Medical Leave Act, FMLA, and it legitimizes that migraine is a chronic condition that may have times of exacerbation, may require you to take a few days off from work, and then that gets filed at your workplace so that you can't be let go because of the fact that you have migraine. And I frequently do that for my patients, and typically we update it once a year.
I think companies can be supportive, but they have to know what they're dealing with and what their employees dealing with.
Yeah, and it's so nice to have that on file because I find that my patients that have it on file, then they don't worry. If they have to call in sick with a migraine, they know that in a sense they're covered, that they have a legitimate medical condition. And it's still amazing though, even despite that, so many patients with migraine feel that others at work either think that they're exaggerating their symptoms to get out of work, or in other cases, patients with migraine are minimizing their symptoms or disability because they feel stigmatized. And I think there's certainly movement now to help with that stigma. But I just encourage those two that are listening to try to not be afraid to let others know that you have this condition. But boy, when you don't have a migraine, you're going to work really hard. Because I find that, most of those with migraine, we're hard workers. I speak as someone that is, and we're not trying to let down our team at work or not try to do our share. But, let's face it, when we have a migraine, we're just not going to be as good at whatever task we're doing.
Right. And somebody else is going to have to pick up that slack, even if you are physically present at work.
Yes. And again, so hopefully you can be honest. And I mean, we've seen examples of this over the years with people that are really famous coming out. And I know one of the famous people that you may have heard of is Serena Branson, the tennis player.
Mm-hmm.
And she often is quoted as saying when she would go out on the tennis court, she often had two opponents. One was the other tennis player, but one was her headache, her migraine. And there have been countless examples like that where even athletes have been a little bit reluctant to come out and say that they have migraine. But I'm so glad when they do because it helps all of us realize we're not alone. Because maybe to backtrack for just a moment, migraine affects 13% of the American adult population. That's the annual prevalence. So that means in any given year, about 13% of adults in the United States are struggling with migraines. So certainly, those of you listening, you are not alone.
That's a lot of people.
It's a lot. It's approaching about 40 million. And then when you look at women in childbearing ages, it can be as high as 25% of women in childbearing. And there again, we think that association with hormones is why women disproportionately get many more migraines and have a higher prevalence than men.
Aside from the hormones, there are probably other triggers that might bring on a migraine. Are there any that you feel are pretty common among migraine sufferers?
Absolutely. Right up there with hormonal changes is stress. Stress is a huge trigger, and that's a big trigger for both men and women. And with that, there are also triggers like lack of sleep, believe it or not, even too much sleep. Some patients in my practice, they would say, why do I have a headache on the weekends when I sleep in? Well, those of us with migraine, our bodies don't like change. So it's often better to have established really good habits, like, with going to bed at the same time, getting up at the same time. But going back to triggers, so stress, lack of sleep, too much sleep, dehydration, not getting enough water, changes in barometric pressure, weather changes. In fact, to the point where some patients will say, I don't even need to listen to the weather report. I know when it's going to rain. And the other thing is travel, because travel often means you're changing the time zone you're in, or things like going up to a higher altitude. I've had countless women who have trouble when they go up to a higher altitude, for example, to go skiing. So there we can come up with short-term preventive strategies. Sometimes food triggers, particularly processed foods, things like aged cheddar cheese, blue cheese, pepperoni, bacon, sausage. And again, I know I keep referring to headaches.org, but I like it because it's an unbiased website. It's not pushing any particular pharmaceutical product. But if you go to headaches.org, it's got a list of foods and it has a list of foods that are unlikely to cause migraine, those that could, and those that are very high triggers. Now, triggers can vary though, Holly, from patient to patient. So I don't think everybody needs to all of a sudden get super strict, for example, with their diet. What you need to do is start again keeping a diary or a calendar and look and see when you get a headache, what was happening 24 hours leading up to that headache? Is it every time you get Chinese food with MSG? Is it every time you go to a certain restaurant? Or you have alcohol, maybe one or two glasses of wine the night before. So, looking for those trends and those associations can really help.
You just said that migraines don't like change. I never thought of that, but probably then keeping that diary would be very helpful.
Extremely helpful. And to give you somewhat of a humorous way to look at it, too, I've had patients that they tend to get more migraines when their in laws are visiting or when they're hosting a holiday. So, there again, we can sometimes come up with short term preventive strategies. And, even good stress. For example, I'm kind of a neat freak. Everything's nice and neat. So, when my wonderful grandchildren, who are 3 and 5 years old, come, my daughter and my son in law, the house can be a little bit of a mess. And that can cause enough stress that I start getting a little bit of a migraine. So I had to kind of catch myself and say, okay, maybe the house doesn't have to be quite so neat when I have my wonderful grandchildren visiting.
Yeah, that's a good trade-off. So the house is a little bit messy, but you get to spend an afternoon or a day with your grandchildren.
It
Yes.
is, but it's hard for us because again, I'm out of my routine. But so that's just one example. But again, going back to the comment about those of us with migraine don't like change, little changes in our routine can really throw things off. So, for example, if I have a patient that says on the weekends, if she sleeps and she gets a migraine, maybe she needs to set her alarm and not sleep in, enjoy that cup of coffee or cup of tea, and maybe take a short nap in the afternoon. But it can make a big difference by having regular sleeping habits, regular eating habits, try not to skip a meal because we're much more sensitive to those changes than someone without migraine.
I recently had an experience. It was about 3 weeks ago. So it started on a Thursday, and I woke up in the middle of the night and I had this horrible, horrible headache. But it was different than a migraine. And a migraine sufferer knows their headache, right? And it lasted for 3 days. So finally, on the third morning, I'm like, I need to find out what's going on here. And it was a Sunday, so I had to go to urgent care. I did that, and you go through your medical history. You explain, yes, I'm a migraine sufferer. They wanted me to go and have a CT scan. So we did that. The hospital is right next door. And, it turns out that their diagnosis was that it was a tension headache. How do you navigate between these headaches?
Well, first of all, I compliment you that you did go to the urgent care. You did the right thing because when your headache seems different, it's not your typical migraine. You do wonder, what is it? Now, in some cases, it could be COVID. It could be a viral illness. In your case, tension headache, that's interesting because normally we think of tension headache, it's a bilateral, pressing, tightening feeling. But typically, tension headache is only mild to moderate severity. And typically, with tension headache, there's no nausea or sensitivity to light. But still, back to your point, I think it was good that you went to the urgent care because it wasn't your typical migraine. And then you had the CT scan, which was normal. So that was very reassuring because it's sometimes if there is a different manifestation or there's a change, sometimes we do imaging of the brain just to be on the safe side. Mm-hmm. So for your listeners or for yourself, if this happens again, maybe don't wait 3 days. I used to do a lot of urgent care work. So if a patient came in and we evaluated the headache, depending on what the diagnosis was, we often would give something called a Toradol injection. It's an anti-inflammatory, kind of like Motrin or Naprosyn. And that might have been able to give you relief that very first day instead of waiting 3 days.
Yeah, I always think I know better, but I I probably should have You also think, oh, it's going to go away. I'm making too big of a deal. I should just lay down, rest. But that's not
No,
always the
we
case.
even I have made that same mistake, kind of wishful thinking, because the problem is if we think it's just going to go away, sometimes then that headache, particularly migraine, starts building and it
Mhm.
gets worse. And you can reach this point of almost no return where medication will help, but it's not going to help as much. And you may not be able to get to zero because you waited. And as you wait, the migraine starts moving, we call it peripherally to centrally, but it starts going up to your higher brain centers. And it's a little harder at that point to turn it around.
And it was. And I could picture the moment when I had reached the point of no return. And it did
Yes.
take a while to right the ship. I could tell you that. The other thing that I'm curious about is that during this time, during, menopause, postmenopause, a lot of women not only are suffering from migraines, but they're also suffering from some mental health issues such as anxiety or depression. Is there a link between those two things?
Oh, there definitely is. So if you look at those with migraine, they're more likely to have anxiety or depression. And then if you look at women that have been diagnosed with depression, they're more likely to either have or develop migraine. So there's a big link. We don't know exactly why when you look at pathophysiology, but it certainly is there, and research is looking at that. Now, the good news is, though, there's very good treatments for both. And so I just encourage women, if you think you might be having anxiety or depression, definitely have that checked out. So I think they both need to be treated, but we would consider them, again, what we call comorbid with each other. So they often coexist. And sometimes that's worse with perimenopause, partly because of, all the ups and downs in hormones. So please don't suffer with that. I think that deserves to be correctly diagnosed and treated appropriately.
Who should you go to first? Or do you think if you're honest with your doctor about what's happening, they're going to suggest you seek some therapy or do some things to help relieve the depression?
Well, ideally, you would see a primary care provider. And when I say PCP, which is what I did for 22 years before I specialized in headache, a primary care provider, it could be family medicine, it could be internal medicine, it could be your gynecologist, because I know I was in an OBGYN group for a number of years where we looked at the whole person. So we had OBGYN, internal medicine, family medicine, all in the same practice. But you typically want to start with a primary care provider, and it doesn't even have to be a physician. There are fantastic nurse practitioners and PAs, because typically I actually have a nurse practitioner I see when I go in for my exams. But the point is, if you start with that person, because I think a good primary care becomes a navigator, kind of the quarterback, if you will, of your team, and they can help diagnose the anxiety or depression. There's some simple screening tools. They may or may not feel that you need medication. They would know who to refer to, whether it's a licensed therapist, a psychologist, a psychiatrist. But I think it's so important for women, particularly as you move into your 40s, to have more than your gynecologist, to have, again, a primary care provider. And some women, if you get a female primary care provider, they can also take over your gynecology. So it's possible for some women that you just have, and I did that for many years, where I did the well woman exam, the gynecology, I did the internal medicine issues. So I was truly looking at the whole person, including being very comfortable diagnosing anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder. So again, I'm not in practice anymore doing that, but I would have been the ideal person. But there are many wonderful women physicians like me, nurse practitioners, PAs all across the country that would love to be your primary care provider, and that would be your starting point.
You know what I've noticed that has changed in the last couple of years? When you go to a doctor, and I'm thinking that this is pretty typical, they now ask a bunch of screening questions. Do you feel safe in the home? That's the only one that comes to mind. So I'm wondering if that has had some impact on women seeking help and getting more efficient care.
Yeah, I hope it has. I think those are now required. Let's say Again, I don't do family medicine anymore, but I think that's required now when patients go in for, let's say, their annual checkup. Things like, do you feel safe at home? I think some of the questions could be, are there any guns at home? And if so, are they locked up? Did you ever feel like you wanted to hurt yourself? And I know it was kind of funny for my recent Medicare wellness exam. They asked things like, are you able to take care of yourself? Well, Holly, I'm one of the healthiest people I know, and I help take care of other people, but they have to ask certain questions. And I understood that. But there was a lot of questions in my case of like being able to manage my finances and take care of myself. Now, having said that, what we in the headache world hope is that one day for any kind of an annual checkup that the provider also has to ask, do you have headaches?
Mm.
Because there's not enough screening now for migraine and headaches, which is why right now we have to be proactive and often be the one to bring it up to our provider.
And I think that's probably why women wait so long to seek help, because you don't think of the headache until you're having it.
Well, I agree. And what's a shame over the years is many women feel that headache is just something that they have to put up with. Many women think it's part of PMS or just part of perimenopause. But keep in mind that for most, it's migraine, and that's a separate condition that deserves its own special treatment. And yes, hormones may help, antidepressants may help, but there are wonderful migraine specific treatments too that could also make a big difference for many of you.
Do you suggest any type of lifestyle changes that could maybe ward off migraines or just get in front of them before they start?
Well, lifestyle, that's a good question because I always ask my patients about it. And I think when I think of lifestyle, I think it's six things. Number one is try to get enough sleep. And it's not just quantity, it's quality. What does that mean? Several hours before you go to bed, turn off electronic devices. I know for me, the best thing is just to read in bed, but not look at my computer screen. Um, Trying to minimize caffeine and alcohol in the evening, and maybe even minimize not drinking too much water because then you're going to have to get up in the middle of the night and go to the bathroom. So looking at quality sleep. Number two, water, water, water. Make sure you're hydrated at least 64 ounces a day. That can really help. And number three, caffeine. We mentioned caffeine being beneficial, but figure out when's the last time of the day you can have caffeine without it interfering with your sleep. For me, it's about 2 or 3 in the afternoon, and I can't have it after that or I will be wide awake. Number four would be diet. Are you eating healthy, regular balanced meals? I think it's important if you can to do more of your cooking at home because then you're in control. But things like, a lot of green leafy vegetables, really emphasizing things like, I know for me, we eat a lot of chicken and fish, but only once in a while will I eat red meat. Red meat can be a little harder to digest. That could interfere with sleep. The other important thing, really important, is exercise. I mean, I'd probably err on the side of exercising too much, but I think it's important too for women, not just aerobic exercise, but I think we really need to get in the gym and do some weightlifting. We need to prevent osteoporosis. But exercise also can just help migraine. It helps relieve stress. And then lastly, please, please do not smoke. Smoking is one of the worst things we can do, not just for headache, but for our bodies. Alcohol can be a little bit of a touchy subject, but I think each woman has to decide for herself. Some of my patients choose not to drink at all. Others may have one glass of wine, maybe in the evening. If you're going to have that glass of wine, maybe do it while you're preparing dinner with dinner, but then switch to water after that. So those are just some of the things. And I think that those are good things for throughout our life. But I think when we have migraine, and as we're getting older, it's extra important because what we're doing now is going to have implications for years to come for our overall health.
All of those lifestyle changes are just good for you anyway, and just something that you should probably be doing just to feel better.
Yeah, just going back to sleep for a moment. Lack of sleep can be a big trigger for migraine. And many of us struggle with sleep as we get older. I often wake up at 3 in the morning, and I kind of joke with a lot of women I know. We say we should just talk to each other because for me personally, I sleep from 10 to 3. I wake up, and then usually the next 2 or 3 hours is disrupted sleep with dreams. So that's something I'm personally working on. What can I do to get better sleep? Because when I do sleep well, I don't know about you, Holly, I feel so much better the next day. I
Yeah.
have this renewed feeling of well-being. And so personally, that's my mission right now. I think good sleep is underappreciated with just how important it is, not just from a migraine perspective, but just feeling good the next day.
Yeah, that 3 o'clock hour is a really rough time to have your sleep disrupted. And by the time you do fall asleep, if it's back at, 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, your day's going to be starting soon.
It's a struggle. I try to just lay there and relax. And my mother used to tell me when I had trouble sleeping. At least if you're laying there, your body is relaxing. But I don't have any perfect answer. But just to reassure women listeners that you're not alone. And for some of you, over-the-counter melatonin may be helpful. There's valerian root, chamomile tea. I'm trying to experiment with different herbal teas that can be relaxing in the evening as I'm getting ready for bed. But I haven't found the magic bullet yet.
Okay, well, you'll let us know, right? If
I will.
if there were just one first step that you would give a woman in managing her migraines, what would that be?
I would recommend you seek good medical advice. Be careful on the internet, which is why I would recommend headaches.org. You can also go to americanheadachesociety.org and you can click on the patient resource part. Those are the two national organizations that just incredible, great information. And for those of you that feel like you're alone, you can also go to things like American Migraine Foundation. So there are just some wonderful resources where you can learn. Because I think the more you learn about migraine, the more empowered you're going to be to then go to your primary care provider or your gynecologist and say, look, this is what I've been noticing. And you can also just learn a lot because I know we talked about acute medication, but for those of you really struggling, there's also a lot of very good preventive treatment. So that some of you, it could be a matter of doing a once a month injection to prevent migraine or an IV medication every 12 weeks. And I'm not here to go into detail with the different treatments, but be aware you first want to confirm the diagnosis, which you pretty much can probably do on your own through these educational websites, and then go to your primary care provider and work with him or her to really come up with a treatment plan that works for you.
Yeah, but having a little direction for them would be helpful. Like you said, you're learning a little bit about it, taking some notes, a journal, a diary of your symptoms and what you're experiencing can, I'm sure, be very helpful when you arrive at the doctor's office and they at least have a little bit of a history with what's going on.
Yeah, and some of these organizations also have webcasts, and a lot of educational tools. So there is a lot out there. If you go particularly again to headaches.org, American Headache Society, and American Migraine Foundation.
Well, before I let you go today, where can we find Dr. Hutchinson? What are you working on anything right now that you'd like people to know about? And because I think after this, we'd still love to connect with you and learn more about what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I had my younger colleague take over my practice about a year and a half ago, thinking I just wanted to retire and enjoy being a grandmother, but I realized I miss seeing patients. So I'm now working with a company called Haven Headache and Migraine Center. We do virtual headache assessment and management here in the state of California. It's a startup company. So basically, 2 days a week, I do virtual consultations. So any of you interested, you can reach me at susan@havenheadache.com. Right now, we're only in the state of California, but hopefully we'll be expanding to other states. But I also know headache doctors all over the country. So I'm happy to respond to emails if you have questions for me. Maybe you want to know who I would recommend in your state. But again, I'm really enjoying still making a difference. And I did write a book, by the way, called The Woman's Guide to Managing Migraine, paperback book. It was published in 2013, so I need to update it, but it still has very good information. And in that book, I tried to look at the hormonal connection to help women understand more. The next book I'm working on that hopefully will be published by April is I think the title is going to be something like New Hope for those with migraine, but I really want to help in more of a booklet form. What are some of the new treatments? Because the last book was 2013 and this is 2025. So that's my next goal is to really help people understand what is out there in terms of treatment.
Well, we'll be on the lookout for your new book, but also the one, can you mention it again, just in case anybody wants to look for
Yeah, it's
it?
called The Woman's Guide to Managing Migraine, Understanding the Hormone Connection to Find Hope and Wellness. It's a paperback book. You can also download it digitally, not much money at all. And you can find it on Amazon. And again, The Woman's Guide to Managing Migraine. But thank you.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for taking the time with us today. This has been really helpful. And as a migraine sufferer, I can never get enough good information. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us on Real Insights. If you want to hear more about how other women find relief from migraines, order your copy of Empart Real Stories, Real Wisdom, Real Menopause on Amazon today. And don't forget to join the conversation at joinempart.com. Until next time, remember that menopause is a journey, but you're not alone.